Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode for 2023 of Intrigue Explained. I'm Dmitry, and with me is John. Hello, John.
Dmitry, how are you?
I am well. For those of you who are tuning in to us for the first time, we are both former Australian diplomats, and we now currently variously run organizations dedicated to trying to explain complex things in ways that we hope make sense but don't put you to sleep. That is a narrow target to hit, but that is what we aim for. I run ExplainTrade, which pretty much does what it says on the tin. And John, you run International Intrigue. What's International Intrigue?
It is a newsletter which does exactly what you just described, tries to interpret the world of global affairs and geopolitics and foreign policy for folks who don't live in that swamp each and every day. It's obviously becoming a far more important part of how the world works, understanding geopolitics and the various machinations. So we try and do that in a way that's fun and engaging.
Can you imagine how great it would be if the world was so quiet and boring that no one had to care?
Yeah, that would be nice, but also we'd be out of jobs. So,
True. Global chaos is worth it for me to be able to afford nice things.
in my more sort of wistful moments, I imagine a peaceful world where I live by a lake and fish, and then I also realize I'd go absolutely insane. So,
Yeah. I feel like the sweet spot is sort of in some ways parts of this week when it was just all balloon related news all the time. We are now shooting down like a
Mhm.
balloon every 15 minutes. John,
And then there are a lot of private companies who have been doing weather research, going, come on, we just raised money for that.
I, I saw, I think it was the former National Security Advisor, John Bolton, was being interviewed, and he spoke at great length and very seriously with his bushy mustache about the possibility of balloons being used to deliver nuclear weapons. Now, John, you are not a national security expert, as it were, but you are in this space. Would you say it is time for our American viewers to march outside and start firing rifles wildly into the sky?
Yes, I would, Dimitri.
Excellent.
No, the only reason I'm not a national security advisor, to be fair, is because I don't have a bushy moustache. I mean, I'm convinced that's 95% of the reason he's had the career he has, is that it's difficult not to take what he says with seriousness, even though what he says often doesn't merit seriousness.
Meanwhile, the two of us managed to look simultaneously 14 and 48. Like,
Yeah.
without any gravitas on our stupid baby faces. Uh,
Next week, I'm going to have a moustache, so you're warned.
if you're listening to the podcast version of Intrigue Explained, don't look our photos up. Just enjoy the content without knowing. You'll be better off for it.
Amazingly, our voices are slightly less annoying than our faces, so there we go.
That is what the market research seems to suggest. So this week, as we try to once again return to our best practices from episode 1 of staying within our 45-minute time slot, we are going to cover our major story, which is geopolitics after the Syria and Turkey earthquake. We are going to try to, in a very perfunctory but hopefully a useful way, catch you up on really the last decade of history of the region in terms of the Syrian civil war, Turkey's role in that war, and then fast forward to today and look at what the crisis means and what it could change and what it spells for the region. We're also, as always, going to look at 3 stories from International Intrigue this week that struck us as something that was worth bringing to your attention. We're going to look at the mass protests that gripped Israel on Monday this week. We are going to look at the surprise resignation of Moldova's pro-EU government. To be fair, it was immediately replaced by another pro-EU government.
A pro-EU government. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
maybe I should have done that reveal, like made it sound more ominous. Yeah, it's, And we are going to look very briefly at the trip of the president of Iran to China and some of Xi's comments around that and the general maneuvering of China versus some of these states that find themselves in opposition to the West. And that's going to be our show. And we're going to dive straight into it, even though we would frankly much rather just do 15 more minutes of balloon jokes. So with that,
each week.
each week, every week, we are the balloon channel that occasionally reluctantly delves into some other stuff. So
Until the next thing comes along.
exactly.
Then we're that.
Yeah. But it's got to be funnier than the balloon thing because like that is a high bar to clear.
Really,
So John,
it is.
set us up. People are protesting in Israel. Tell us why. Tell us what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. So it's actually been going on for a little while now, maybe a week and a half or so. But as you alluded to at the start, this past Monday saw tens of thousands of Israelis protest in Jerusalem and across the country, which is pretty. I mean, I wouldn't say rare in Israel, but it's certainly notable at the protests are at this scale. Tens of thousands, arguably hundreds of thousands across the country, and it's, as I said, it's been going on for a little while. What they're upset about, what the protesters are upset about, is a slate of reforms that is being proposed by the government, led by the indefatigable Benjamin Netanyahu. And the idea here is that they want to reform Israel's top court, so their equivalent of the Supreme Court or whatever. What's I think got in Benjamin Netanyahu's craw, so to speak, is that the government has the top court has, like any top court, a fair bit of power to block what the government of the day wants to do. And his reforms would essentially give Parliament, the Israeli Parliament, the ability to overrule Supreme Court decisions with a simple majority. So, the Supreme Court says you can't, this bill that you want to pass is not okay, and then they say, okay, well, we're going to pass a veto on your veto, as it were. So that's quite a rare thing. I think most viewers and listeners will understand how that court government dynamic generally interplays in a democracy, and it's certainly pretty rare to have a government be able to vote down a Supreme Court decision with a simple majority. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is that he wants a lot more control over the committee that appoints the judges to that court. So this is the idea of, court stacking, which you might kind of be familiar with if you're familiar with US Supreme Court politics. The idea that if you stack 80% of your favored judges on a court, then you don't need to worry about the decisions they make. So that's kind of what's happening. The protests are obviously against that, saying that these reforms threaten Israel's democracy.
And I think it's a fascinating thing because there's the strictly Israeli side to this, which is, as all local issues always are, really complicated. Israel doesn't have a formal written constitution that the court can rely on to issue judgments. So instead, in ruling whether laws are legal or not, it relies on this evolving kind of web of precedent. So it's kind of, I mean, I'm not a lawyer and you very much are, but from a judicial standpoint, I suppose you could argue it's on slightly shakier ground than something like the US Supreme Court. On the other hand, this is a really extreme thing to do. By definition, an Israeli government has a majority in the Knesset. It's a parliamentary system.
Right.
So it's almost like basically saying if you say that all you require to overturn a Supreme Court ruling is a simple majority in the Knesset, the government will almost always be able to do it. So you've virtually eliminated the Supreme Court as a check on the legislature. If
You've made it redundant, basically, haven't you?
Yeah. You'd basically be relying on his coalition fracturing or something else happening in order for him not to be able to do it.
Right, and I think that's an interesting point because there's a sort of a famous political idea that you shouldn't ever do anything that you wouldn't want your political enemies, to be able to have. So the idea that you don't want to pass laws that give supreme power, because one day you'll be out of government and your enemies will be able to use them against you. But I mean, Bibi Netanyahu is as experienced a kind of democratic politician as exists on planet Earth right now, probably. And he's aware of that kind of idea. And I think the fact that he's willing to push ahead with these kinds of reforms, there's probably internal politics with his hardline coalition
Hmm.
pushing him to do this. So we don't know if this is his kind of like, if he'd do this in a vacuum, perhaps not. But the fact that he's doing it, I think speaks to how comfortable he feels in the right wing domination of Israeli politics at the moment. That, at least not in the foreseeable future, will the left get in charge and be able to do things that a court might have stopped. So I think it sort of speaks to his power. But I guess a question for you is this kind of emblematic, not just of Israeli politics, but of global politics, of when a government, particularly right-wing governments, but extreme governments, I would say, of both sides, in this case, it's a right-wing government, that they just want to get rid of all these democratic checks and balances, that this is their MO.
I think it is. I would say, first of all, one thing it's emblematic of is that principle you were talking about before, about don't hand or don't instill any kind of power dynamic that you wouldn't want your political rivals to use, really relies on a party framework where everybody is thinking in terms of long-term legacy of the party. It doesn't work as well when you've
Right.
got like a Trump or a Bolsonaro or perhaps even a Netanyahu who maybe just isn't that invested in what happens to conservatives
In
that
the
aren't
system.
them. Like he's like, oh, 10
Yeah.
years from now, they're going to screw my successor's successor. Meh. Who gives a damn? This is about doing what I want to do and removing those checks. I will say though that it does feel like it's a broader pattern. You see this a lot with the Tory party in the UK of effectively using the line that any check on what a democratically elected government wants to do is
Yeah.
undemocratic. You see this line, whether it was, on the EU with the ECJ, the European Court on Human Rights. You see this in the US with attacks on institutions and checks and balances. It's this kind of idea that we don't just live in
Populism.
democracy. It's populism, and it's like this yearning for direct democracy, but not really. And I think
Mm.
it's quite
Yeah.
dangerous as a concept, even if, as you say, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it's an intoxicating argument, isn't it? Because to argue against it, you basically have to be arguing against the will of the people and saying, they don't always make the best decisions, or that we shouldn't go with, you have to argue some sort of tyranny of the majority argument. And I think in this era of sound bites and, poor faith arguing, it's really difficult to make that point, because your political enemies just say, oh, they think they know they're better than you, they're elites, So I think, yeah, it's an interesting point you make. I think it's
yeah.
true, sadly.
um, Speaking of actually not right wing governments, we can move on to our next story. John, I think you're all over this one. So why don't you tell us about Moldova?
Yes, well, as a long term expert on Moldovan politics, I'll take this one, Dmitry. Obviously, um, no. What I've learned over the
Pronounce
last
their
week is
names,
that
John.
I've had to. Yeah, this is what I was going to throw to you, but I'll have a go. So this story is that late last February, Moldova's Prime Minister Natalia Gavrilita. How did I do, Gavrilita?
Gavrilita.
Close enough.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. We'll get the resident Ukrainian to do it. um, but she resigned last Friday along with all of her government. So a little bit of background on well, firstly, a bit of background on Moldova. It obviously borders Ukraine. It's been worried throughout this last year of the war in Ukraine spilling over its borders. It has a small strip on its border with Ukraine called Transnistria that is technically Moldovan sovereign territory, but it has had a permanent station of about 1,500 Russian troops and is widely seen to be fairly pro-Russian. And, I wouldn't say it's kind of like a breakaway region yet, but it's kind of in that space of like Luhansk, Donetsk, Russian influence, whatever. So that's where Moldova is. Gavrilita, their now former PM, was very pro EU. She'd put Moldova on a path to becoming much more closely integrated with the EU. I think they were on the path to accession along with Ukraine for about a year or so. And she was elected on that platform as a reformer of, the old Soviet kind of politics. They were certainly looking west, let's put it that way. Now, the president, Maya Sandu, so they have a president prime minister kind of situation. She has appointed a new PM, and that PM seems to be, it was a former national security advisor, and seems to largely be fairly continuous policy-wise with Gadvalita. So it's weird because, again, I don't know enough about Moldovan politics to sort of say what happened to cause her resignation. There was some sense that she wasn't able to get the domestic support for those reforms. But then the president, who is popular and has enough of a majority to be able to appoint her successor, is expected to do the same thing. So I suspect this is a situation where there were, internal politics in Moldova that, whether it was her personally, the former prime minister personally not having the power that she once had, or something, because I don't think this changes Moldova's general trajectory away from Russia and towards the West. Not as I see it anyway.
I think what makes this more than just a local Moldovan story, though, is the pressure that was being applied on the country, both intentionally and incidentally, by Russia as a result of its invasion of Ukraine. Moldova's energy grid was kind of hit in two ways. It was connected to the Ukrainian, is partially connected to the Ukrainian energy grid, which means that attacks on the Ukrainian energy grid have consequences for Moldovan power. But they also have relied on Russian gas, and so the sort of fluctuations in gas prices saw inflation in Moldova go through the roof, and there were popular protests around that. Russia has been sort of making threatening noises in Moldova's direction in the way that it does for quite some time. And most recently, and what sort of maybe correlation rather than causation, Russian missiles flew over Moldovan territory. They didn't hit Moldova, but that triggered a sort of national security crisis for Moldova.
Well, if we see what happens over a balloon, imagine a missile flying over your country, right? Like, it's a fairly like poignant violation of your airspace.
Right. And I think the Moldovans can see what happens when across their border. And so kind of all of this led President Zelensky to issue this official warning that Russia was going to attempt to destabilize Moldova. Now, I don't think this looks like a destabilization.
Well, but interestingly, when the prime minister resigned and the president appointed or announced that she would appoint the new sort of prime minister who's pro-EU, she basically confirmed what Zelensky had been saying for months, which had been that there was a Russian plot to overthrow the Moldovan government from the inside. So we had Zelensky saying it for a while, and I think there was correct me if I'm wrong here, but there was a feeling a little bit that like Zelensky might have been a bit paranoid or getting outside his lane a little bit in terms of that. Perhaps, I don't know. But the president of Moldova basically confirmed his account, which is interesting, because if Russia had plans to overthrow the government, it's clear to me now that Moldova's gone the other way, and Russia's efforts have been, have shot themselves in the foot a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's one thing that's become abundantly clear watching Russia's intelligence services lately is that it is entirely possible that there was a plan and that they had completely bungled it. These are also the people who were saying that Russian troops would be welcomed with open arms, and the people who and the people who, when they were told to buy 3 SIM cards to plant in the fake Ukrainian saboteurs' Nazi den, bought 3 copies of the Sims video game. So it's not necessarily that these are.
I didn't know that.
That is the greatest story ever. But like, these are not. I think generally the public massively overstates how easy it is for a foreign intelligence service of any competence to actually overthrow a government kind of on its
I think
own.
that's right.
Even the CIA coups throughout Latin America were overwhelmingly about supporting existing factions. I'm not even going to touch with a 1,000-foot stick how stupid the allegations that the U.S. ambassador and George Soros triggered Euromaidan or the Arab Spring are. Is this idea that they can just wave a magic wand and create a revolution? I think if the CIA and Mossad can't do it, Russian clowns definitely can't. But it looks like they might have been trying.
Yeah, yeah. I don't have anything to add to that. I think it's a really important message to remember that it's good for conspiracy theories and John Clancy thrillers, but it's really hard to overthrow a government in any kind of competent, neat, calm way where you're going to get the result you want. It's probably easier to kind of destabilize a government and cause problems, but you kind of have no idea what's going to happen after that.
Exactly. And I'm not sure if that last little bit was newsworthy. I just really wanted to dunk on the
It's
FSB for a few
fascinating.
solid minutes. And, it's our show. We can do what we like. All right.
Exactly.
Our next topic, back very much in your turf area of expertise. Iran has gone looking for friends in Beijing, and it may have found them.
Well, yes. So this is the story that the Iranian leader, Ebrahim Raisi, I think his name is pronounced. And again, forgive me, folks, for butchering names, but he visited Beijing for a state visit, which is the first state visit by an Iranian president, I think, in about 20 years. And certainly Raisi's first visit to China. So it's a big deal. Like in a vacuum, this would be a big deal. A state visit to China is a big deal on its own. First one in 20 years is a big deal. So you have that. It's a big deal. But what's behind it is even more interesting, and that's this idea that late last year, Xi Jinping visited the Middle East. Most notably, he went to Saudi Arabia and signed all manner of various, mutual cooperation and development pieces of paper, as presidents and diplomats love to think it's a big win. But what they do signal is the nature of the relationship, right? Xi Jinping doesn't go to Saudi Arabia and sign those documents if they don't want to have a good or at least a better relationship. The problem there is that Saudi Arabia and Iran are historically mortal enemies. And Iran got very, very ticked off that Xi Jinping went to Saudi Arabia and didn't go to Iran. So in the intervening months, what are we, 3 months since she went to 2 months since she went to Saudi Arabia, Iran's been making noises that I think have been interesting, but probably pretty troubling for Beijing, saying things like, well, the relationship with China is not what it was. We are concerned about its direction. Trade isn't good enough. Investment isn't good enough. All this kind of stuff. So Iran clearly was very ticked off. And that's not good for China because China, I think China has probably got some reservations about Iran and the way it does business, particularly its proximity to Russia and in the military sense and in the Ukraine war sense. But it is they are natural partners because they are anti-US hegemony, anti-US global order. So I think Beijing wanted to fix that, at least superficially, just to keep Iran quiet and keep things on an even footing. So that's kind of what happened with Raisi's visit. I don't know if you've got any kind of extra insights to add to that.
No, something I was thinking about is, we've got this quote from from Xi saying China supports Iran in safeguarding national sovereignty, resisting unilateralism and bullying. And I was just thinking, if you kind of think about that message, it is this emerging unifying message among a number of states whose primary concern is that the West not interfere in the things that they want to do, especially domestically. They don't, or anyone interferes, but they're talking about the West. And that there is this axis of, they're not necessarily allies. Even the BRICS don't have solidarity on this, but it is a range of states who all kind of position themselves in opposition to what they see as interventionism in their domestic affairs by a US-led West. And so you do have these, it is a strange thing that an Islamic theocracy an incredibly hardline Islamic theocracy would be kind of courting China, whose relationship with its with religion generally and with its domestic Muslim minority hasn't historically been the best, to massively sugarcoat that. But you do have this kind of enemy of my enemy, or this unifying strength. Do you think that's what's happening here?
I do. I think you've put your finger on it. It's China's overarching vision for the world is one in which it can exist without anybody telling it what to do, without anybody constraining it. I think there's arguments about whether it wants world domination in the same way that US did. I tend to think it doesn't, but it definitely wants to be able to say, go jump to anybody it wants to. And part of that is that it needs to roll back, at least to some extent, the US liberal global order. And the most effective way, sitting down in the strategic kind of war room 15, 20 years ago, the most effective way to do that is to appeal to every country that has similar feelings about American led world order. So, Russia, Brazil, as we've said, China, a bunch of Southeast Asian countries, Iran, much of the Middle East, and say, hey, listen, we don't really care what you're doing. Don't bother us. We won't bother you. But where we will come together is pushing back against the bad people over there who want to tell you what to do. And it's a compelling vision for the world if you're an Iranian theocracy. What sounds better than being able to do exactly what you want to do without sanctions, or with at least pressure to roll back sanctions, being able to freely trade, like all these kinds of things. China's promising that if you follow us, or at least you stand with us, we can get rid of all those things you hate. So it's a compelling vision. Some folks might say it's nihilistic and cynical, but in another way, it's like, well, that's just quite a natural thing that people want, right? Like, you don't want people peering over your back fence. If the first way you stand on your own is to say, stop looking in my backyard.
Is there an element of, I don't want to say paranoia, but what unites almost all of these regimes, in a lot of cases, many of these regimes, I should say, is that they sort of live in fear of being removed from power. And the two ways that can happen are a domestic uprising, which they build a security apparatus to contain, and then some external actor. And so there's this sense of, if we leave each other alone, if we don't interfere in our ability to quash the domestic, we can unite against external pressures.
Absolutely. And I think they're often not as nicely split up as you just said. I think external pressures and domestic uprisings are, to the point we were talking about in Moldova, there's probably, not to speculate too wildly because I have absolutely no idea, but like, I'd be surprised if there wasn't some CIA encouragement in the Iranian protests, and I would be surprised if there wasn't some, MI6 angle on various different uprisings in Russia and China. Like, I'm not saying, again, certainly they aren't causing it and they can't lead it, but like, I'd be shocked if they weren't sort of, let's put it this way, paying very close attention to it. So
Yeah.
not only do you have this idea of China telling Iran or any country in a similar position, hey, we don't care what you do domestically to your people, beyond, vaguely worded principles, but we aren't going to be working with them in any sense. You don't have to be stressed about us having agents in your, I mean, of course they do, but that's the message is like, not only we will not tell you what to do, we won't bother you. So it's like this dual angle of just live and let live, which is, I think, a very compelling message. I don't know if it's great for the world order, certainly not great for the world order and for people like us who grew up in and have profited from the way things have been for the last 80 years. But I mean, I try not to be morally like equivalent, but I also try not to be pro-Western just blindly. And I can understand why these countries sit there and put their differences aside, because China's offering a compelling vision that will make their world, not the Iranian people necessarily, but the Iranian leaders, the people who are religious hardliners, it makes things a lot better for them.
Yeah. And it's something to watch as this sort of axis of countries emerges, and whether it can form an
Yeah,
effective bridge of opposition or not is still to be determined. But it's really interesting to watch.
right. I should say it's not just Iran too, right? Like China's been trying to do this in Venezuela. It's been doing this all across Africa. Anywhere where your government isn't doing what the US would have it do in as a good global citizen, to use that phrase, China will be there knocking on doors saying, "Isn't this whole thing bullshit? Let's not do this anymore. Come with us, and we'll let you do what you want. Plus, maybe we'll invest or whatever." Which was part of the Iranian visit too. Was like, you need to promise more investments in like a train line and the national airport and stuff. So it's like, it's not just like, I should say, it's not just like Iran wants the US off its back. They do, but they also want China to fill the gap of the world order as well. What's important to remember, and maybe we should move on, but is that no one wants a vacuum. No one wants the US to roll back without China stepping up, because a vacuum is even scarier than a world order that you kind of know and have built your architecture around dealing with.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to kind of finish that one off on. And that brings us
I'm
to
not sure if you can hear this, Dmitry, but like there's like ice slamming into the windows here. So I apologize if there's any
No.
noise of like pattering ice smashing the window, but Chicago in February, right?
That's not just people outside, just like Chinese intelligence
Telling me to
officers
shut
outside
up.
pelting your windows.
Could well be.
Sovereignty. That's why I've got the shutters down. And that brings us to our main story of the week. This is something we teased, I should say, we spoke about last week when the earthquake first hit, and we didn't cover it last week in too much detail because we felt it was too soon. It's still, frankly, it'll feel like too soon forever, but the consequences of the geopolitical consequences of this horrendous earthquake are significant. And it's worth having a discussion about what they mean, as well as, I think, a fairly our best truncated version to just catch you up on what has been happening along this Turkey-Syrian border, because it is so fundamental to world peace, to geopolitics, to everything. So, John, do you want to maybe just start us off? Obviously, look, the earthquake happened. There have been, I think, 41,000 casualties, but take us back maybe a little bit. Could you just give us a short overview of Turkey and Syria, maybe beginning with the Syrian civil war?
Yeah, this is such an easy task. This is stuff
Yeah.
that like armies of people write PhDs on. But to understand that region, you need to have a really in-depth understanding of all the different strains of religion and all this kind of stuff. But let me give you the overview of it. With apologies for any kind of inaccuracies or leaving out the details. But we'll start the story, I guess, in 2011 with the Arab Spring, which folks might remember was a really quick and relatively spontaneous uprising across North Africa and the Middle East, where a bunch of different countries, Tunisia, I think it started in Tunisia, if memory serves, and sort of spread very quickly in 2011, with people coming onto the streets demanding, I think demanding democracy, but if not democracy, an end to this swathe of regimes that they had seen as kind of pretty authoritarian and not responsive to the people. Barack Obama was in power. This was his whole idea of like America should lead from behind by like not getting involved, but offering moral support. And Syria, the Arab Spring hit Syria in a big way. So there were big protests on the streets of Damascus against Bashar al-Assad, who has been in power for, the numbers escape me, but a long time. I think he came to power in the early 2000s. He's from a political dynasty in Syria. You might fact check that while I talk about when he came to power, but he's been in charge for a long time, and he's always been a pretty hardline kind of leader. So when the protests broke out across Syria in 2011, he cracked down on them big time, like violently and sharply, which didn't help things initially. He he came under more pressure. There were rebel groups that sprung up, and basically it was the start of what we now know as the Syrian civil war. So in that you have two sides. Well, no, you have multiple
Many
sides, but two
sides.
major sides in the civil war, which were this group of rebels and other disparate political factions who had long opposed Assad's regime, and it's a religious thing as well here. And then you have obviously the Syrian government army and the state, and they really fought a brutal war for 4 or 5 years until sort of 2015, 2016. This is the kind of stuff that folks might remember from the news of suspected chemical attacks, carpet bombing of cities. Aleppo, for example, in the north, which is a ancient sort of bastion of civilization, has been essentially wiped off the map before the earthquake. But it was a particularly brutal civil war. Now, where it gets a little bit more complex regionally is Russia entered the war pseudo unofficially, but fairly obviously, on the side of Bashar al-Assad, and including not just doing what like the West is doing for Ukraine now, like Russian airplanes with Russian pilots flew into Syrian airspace and bombed Syria. So like they were directly involved on the side of Bashar al-Assad, and Turkey took the other side. So they've been sort of supporting probably a little less obviously, but I think pretty obviously still. And they've been supporting this alliance of rebels and whatnot, certainly funding them and sending them weapons, but also I think shelling and bombing things along the border. And there's this, again, it's such a complex issue. You layer on top of that Kurdistan, or the Kurdish homeland, sits between Syria, Iraq, and Turkey there on the northern kind of border, if you've got a map to hand. And Turkey has long had problems with the Kurds. The Kurds don't like the Turks, but the Kurds are also caught up with not liking the Syrians, or at least the Bashar al-Assad regime. So there's this, and then lastly, put into the mix ISIS, which came around during this period as well, which was kind of maybe the only thing everyone could kind of agree on was that they were awful. So the US kind of got involved in a way with a Western alliance under the guise of fighting ISIS, but they were sort of also on the side of the rebels. So it's just this really messy mix that has been going on in Syria for 11 years, which has obviously got a border with Turkey, and that's kind of the background. I don't know. How did I do?
I mean, a pretty good job considering the complexity of the situation, because you effectively had Bashar al-Assad and his Russian allies fighting the rebels and the Kurds. You had the Turks, whose primary focus, and they launched 4 fairly significant military operations on Syrian territory over the period, over the last decade. Their primary focus was on defeating the Kurds, but they were also supporting the rebels to an extent. But their concern was that US support was going to kind of both groups of rebels. So the Turks felt that they couldn't trust the US anymore, because they weren't just kind of backing the Turkish position. And Turkey is a member of NATO, which kind of piles another layer of complexity on top of this. And then there is a 2016 attempted military coup in Turkey, which further complicates the kind of relationship between the army, Erdogan, the president of Turkey. So all of this is in the mix. Syria becomes a pariah state,
a failed
on
state.
the world. It becomes a failed state and becomes a pariah state on the world stage.
Big time.
That border region where the earthquake hit specifically is among the worst sort of affected parts by the.
It's where all the fighting was, yeah.
It's where the fighting was. And so you have the situation where aid can't get in to Syria. Aid can get into Turkey, but it's complicated near the border. And all of this is happening at the worst possible time for a region that is just exhausted by a decade of horrific conflict.
Yeah. So okay. I mean, so we've got a bit of background there, and then the earthquake, as you said. I mean, beyond horrific, but the regional kind of geopolitics spinning out of that is like, what might the earthquake change about the very uneasy, I wouldn't say balance of power, but the uneasy situation that was already there. And I think, there's a couple of things. One is that, will Syria become less of a pariah state based on the fact that, it needs aid, but it's going to be not strengthened per se, but it's going to be less. Uh, it's harder to make it a pariah state if it's suffering through this earthquake. It's looking for aid. You have to have you're basically requiring people to say no. What you've done in the past trumps the fact that you need aid now, so we're still not going to deal with you, and that's a much harder thing to do. So you've got that angle, and then the angle that I think is really interesting and is President Erdogan is up for re-election in May. He was already facing a tough re-election bid. I think most folks thought he would get re-elected, but probably with a reduced mandate. But the Turkish side of this earthquake, where it hit was largely in Turkey, but there has been more destruction than I think even the most cynical folks would have said in Turkey, because there is this sense that about 75,000 buildings in the region didn't meet building codes. Erdogan has made part of his kind of rebuilding of Turkey, his nationalism, a construction site. We are building Turkey for the 21st century. We're putting up apartment blocks. We're developing your cities. We're making us into a modern country. And then you have what appears to be systemic corruption around building codes, local officials taking kickbacks to sort of, allow builders to get around these codes, and even official government policy saying that, well, if you've built a building in 2016, you don't have to retrofit it because that would be expensive. My point here is that there is a growing sense that a lot of this destruction could have been avoided, but for Turkey's political system. And Erdogan is so deeply representative of what Turkey's political system is that I think it's a very open question about whether Turks say, oh boy, this is a really stark demonstration of where the country is going if Erdogan is allowed to remain in charge. And we are going to become a country that, I mean, forgive me for saying it, that looks a lot like Russia, where you have a strong person who puts a coat of paint on stuff, but when you look behind the curtain, i.e. Russia's military now, Turkey's building codes, the country's actually falling apart. And if Erdogan doesn't get reelected, whole new conversation about regional geopolitics, right?
Yeah. I think there's a symmetry here, because Erdogan was initially elected in part by railing against how unprepared Turkey was for the last earthquake. There was a massive
Yeah.
earthquake.
In the north, right?
Just under a decade ago, and there was this sense at the time. There was one of the things that Erdogan pledged to do was create this fund to not just rebuild Turkey, but rebuild Turkey up to code, and to make sure that the government is ready and that the buildings are up to scratch. And I mean, there's an extent to which, look, you can't really prepare for an earthquake like this so that nothing happens. But there is this sense that initially the reaction was the sort of support was coming from local civil society, not from the central government. And there was this, one of Erdogan's recent kind of triumphs, achievements, is he went to this region and, as you say, issued a blanket amnesty to I think like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of buildings that weren't built up to code. And that was
For
this
an
kind
election,
of,
right?
yeah, exactly, as a way of saying, like, look, I've just legitimized all of your homes with the stroke of a
Vote for
pen.
me. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's obviously not going to be, if I was a politician, I wouldn't want that clip looping against B-roll
Right.
of collapsed buildings. So he,
Yeah.
with that.
So
Mhm.
sorry, I was just going to say, I think one of the interesting things there is that I think he still will get reelected, just because, I mean, I'm not a Turkish political expert, but it just looks from everything I've read that he still just controls so many of the levers of power that he can turn it on and get reelected. But do you want to speculate about, and it's obviously ridiculous to speculate too far in advance, but if he doesn't get reelected, what does that look like for the region? Like, one of his main kind of driving forces is making Turkey this linchpin in that region, this regional power, that everyone has to go through if you want to deal in that area, in that region. What happens if he's not there anymore?
So I think, given the geographic location of Turkey, given the size of Turkey, it would take a very weak successor not to attempt to continue playing that
Do the
local
same thing.
regional
Yeah.
kingmaker role, whether it's control of the strait, whether it is just sitting halfway between China and the West in a lot of ways, whether it's sort of being the kind of government that Russia can still talk to, even though it is part of NATO. So in some ways, a a more left, a center left government replacing him, which, by the way, if you look at the Turkish polls, at least before the earthquake, wasn't necessarily on the cards. They were probably,
No.
you could imagine a center left coalition possibly pushing him into a runoff election, but it's hard to see. He was still solidly ahead, and as you say, he controls the levers of power in a way that helps him more than it helps an equivalent politician in the UK or
Right.
the US.
I think a lot of the folks who are hopeful that he is on the way out are looking and putting too much importance on like Istanbul's politics, and Istanbul has famously given him a rebuke in the last couple of years with electing a mayor, I think, or at least a governor, a prominent politician in Istanbul who was from the opposition side, but Istanbul is not Turkey, so I think you're
Yeah.
absolutely right that Erdogan was
Well,
probably going to get elected.
which again brings that parallel back to Russia, right? Where the
Yeah, exactly.
you can be incredibly deceived about Russian politics and the mood of the Russian nation if all you've done is hung out
You
in
focus
a
on Moscow,
Moscow and sort of talk to the people who live there.
St. Petersburg. Yeah.
Yeah, Moscow, Peter. Like you can, it's easy to be misled in that way, and I think Turkey has moments of the same thing. But
Yeah.
the I suppose the optimistic part of me, not that I have any particular strong sort of feeling about individual Turkish politicians, but I feel like if the allegations about the way that he has prepared the country for an earthquake, if the way that he has governed, if they are true, I want to believe that things like that still have consequences in
Yeah.
democratic countries. So less so than like about him personally. If this is true, I'm hoping that he at least is made to sweat and made to answer some really hard questions, and that he isn't
Hmm.
able to completely shut out the opposition, because that would, you've got to at least hold his feet to the fire, I think, in situations like this, and
Yeah.
for
It's
the
a
region
bad thing
to,
if the lesson.
yeah,
Yeah, it's a bad thing if the lesson he learns is like, oh, literally nothing I do matters because
yeah.
I will get reelected and it doesn't have any consequences. I know we've got to wrap up, but before we go, what does Syria look like post earthquake? In not physically, obviously it's horrific, but does Bashar al-Assad start to become someone who can leave his country and shake hands with leaders elsewhere, or does it not change too much?
I mean, I guess my answer to that would be, how many leaders outside of Moscow and a handful of others would want that photo op or would be willing to put up? Like, forget geopolitics and positioning. Not many people want to be seen shaking this man's hand. So, does he move to a point where he can go to New York and not be arrested at the airport to go visit the United Nations? Maybe. They're probably not. Um, does this will this kind of help humanize him a tiny bit? Yes. Is he does he has the door cracked a few inches? Absolutely, but fundamentally he's not going to change. The civil war isn't fully over. The brutality is still very much in place, and people still remember who he is and what he's done. I don't think he's going to be able to buy his way back in to the sort of society of civilized leaders, because this isn't like a situation where there is a, say, a coup in a country and a bunch of, say the West doesn't recognize the new leader for a while, and then afterwards the status quo, they slowly get introduced, the sort of Maduro situation. It's
Maduro,
not
yeah, that's what's
it,
spring to my mind.
this that's not a good parallel here, because this isn't just about who's in power. It's about some horrific human rights crimes. And frankly, he's not hugely needed in the fold of civilized nations. We don't,
Yeah,
the West
that's the
doesn't
key.
need Bashar al Assad in the tent, very frankly. And that,
Yeah,
I think, makes a big difference if we're being
yeah.
cynical, and we are.
Well, just realistic about the geopolitics. Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
completely agree.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end. We're a few minutes late, but hopefully this has been a useful
Better than last
discussion.
week.
Better than last week. Exactly. We're getting better. We're improving. We're shutting the hell up for science. So thank you so much for tuning in, for listening to us. As always, if you're watching this on YouTube, if you could drop us a like, a subscribe, or a comment if anything we've said has tickled your fancy, or you want to argue with us for being wrong about everything, please do let us know.
Yeah,
And
that'd
yeah,
be good.
and we will, as always, be releasing the podcast version of this without the horror of our faces shortly after this live recording ends. It would be great if you could recommend it to your friends, drop it a like and subscribe. It'll be on all of your favorite Spotify's and such. And yeah, until next week, I'm Dmitry Grozoubinski.
And I'm John Fowler. Thank you very much, guys.
You can tell we didn't rehearse that. And yeah, sign up to International Intrigue's newsletter. It's free
We
and
haven't
it's
rehearsed
great.
anything. If we rehearse stuff, this would be, far more polished.
What a world.
With that.
All right. With that, thanks so much, guys. We'll see you next week.